Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
I am less than 24 hours from getting on a plane land actually in Anchorage, Alaska. And I'm speaking in Anchorage Thursday night. The Alaskan Atheists have been so amazing in putting together a night. It's going to happen in the auditorium at the Anchorage Museum, and all are invited. It's going to be a great time. I'm doing a presentation that's called The Beauty of Doubt, and it's kind of a fun ride through theistic belief and how religion approaches the issue of doubt. And there's a lot of storytelling in it and a lot of levity and hopefully a few things that people can take home with them. And then my favorite part of the evening will be after the presentation, where we all just kind of hang out and talk and exchange ideas and laugh and share stories and just be skeptics together. And so that's happening on Thursday night. All the details are on the events page at thethinkingatheist.com. Friday, while I'm in Alaska, my lady and I are going to be getting married, and then we'll spend the weekend in Alaska, be back early next week. Next week's podcast are a 1, 2, 3 punch. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, there will be 3 30-minute speeches from the Unholy Trinity Tour with myself, Matt Dillahunty, and Aaron Raw. Traveling is awesome, but it stresses me out if it's a long trip and everybody's going. And the main reason is my animals. But I am excited. I fell in love with Alaska 4 years ago. I was up there for a business trip, and I just promised I would get back. And when Natalie and I were talking about wedding plans, Alaska to me just seemed like a great idea, and she was all about that. So we're going to go and just have a quiet, small ceremony with a beautiful Alaskan backdrop, and then we'll be back home next week. And I'm really excited about it, and I'll post some photographs. Thanks to everybody for all the good stuff. It's amazing to have a family this big. To have a family is wonderful. To have a family like the Thinking Atheist community is beyond words. I just can't. It sounds corny, but I'm dead serious. To have people sending me all of these greetings, and we're so excited for you, and they're sharing the experience, and they're just so wonderful. And it's tremendously humbling. I was just driving home today, and I was just kind of thinking about it, how honored I am to be able to have all of you in my life. You bring a tremendous measure of joy and support and goodness and laughter, and to be able to share sort of this Alaskan experience in this way with you means a lot to me. So thank you for that. And thank you for listening to the show tonight. I'm going to start with an email. It's a rather long one, but before I get to my special guest, I thought this was a great way to kick off the broadcast. It was sent to me by Herbert from South Carolina. The email goes like this. I've heard secular leaders, including David Silverman, president of American Atheists, suggest that theists are mentally ill. Silverman has stated that parents who believe their children can be cured of physical illness with prayer should be evaluated on inpatient units in a psychiatric hospital. The word delusion is tossed around freely in conversations between atheists and among like-minded skeptics and agnostics. By the way, Herbert, I'd like you to source that for me. I don't remember Silverman saying it. I know he has a pretty hard line when it comes to believers. But I'd like you to source that for me, because I'd be curious to see where that information, when you say words like mentally ill, I'd like to find out where that came from. The email continues. The idea that the vast majority of theists have faith because of severe mental illness is a dangerous idea. It's an idea that could hurt society in many ways if enough people are convinced of it and governments follow with lawmaking to validate the idea. It's possible to be wrong and not be delusional. It's possible to have a strongly held belief that is built on some logical fallacies and not have a psychotic disorder. First, I will explain what a delusional psychosis is and then I will expand briefly on how individuals and society could suffer needlessly if we aren't carefully distinguishing between an actual delusion and a strongly held belief. Merriam-Webster's full definition of delusion states it is either A, the act of deluding, the state of being deluded, or B, a persistent, false, psychotic belief regarding the self or persons or objects outside the self that's maintained despite indisputable evidence to the contrary. The shortened version states that it is either A, a belief that is not true, or B, a false idea or belief that is caused by mental illness. A closer look at the definitions reveals the origin of our struggle here. One way of defining the word is to simply understand that beliefs that are not true are delusions. I suppose then I'm deluded when I think I'll be able to lose 10 pounds before taking my family to the beach next month. The second definitions are more sharply defined as beliefs that are both psychotic and caused by mental illness. In my personal life, I'm a husband, a father, a skeptic, and a huge fan of the Thinking Atheist website, podcast, and social media communication. Professionally, I'm a psychiatrist, meaning I'm a medical doctor with training in behavioral health. I attempt to diagnose and make recommendations for the treatment of mental illness. Many forms of mental illness, such as schizophrenia, and severe forms of bipolar disorder and severe major depressive disorder can cause functional disability and destroy lives. Psychiatric disorders are a leading cause of the financial costs related to disability internationally. Carefully distinguishing genuine forms of severe mental illness from commonly held belief systems that are within the wide range of the normal, healthy human experience is paramount if we are to make any meaningful gains in connecting psychotic patients with the services they need. The cost associated with assessing care is rising, the resources are generally static or possibly shrinking, and the numbers of patients with severe forms of mental illness at least remain the same if they're not increasing, as modern life is increasingly stressful and complex to navigate. In psychiatry, the word delusion is used with a degree of caution. Delusion implies a complete departure from reality and an underlying neurobiology that creates thoughts, ideas, or beliefs held so tightly and in such a way that they are distinguishable and departed from culturally bound ideas. Patients with delusions often have severe problems with information processing and understanding social norms. They often have hallucinations and paranoid ideas of being persecuted and haunted. Every day, new genetic markers for schizophrenia are being researched to help us better understand this illness. Functional magnetic resonance imaging studies are giving us a glimpse of the damaged human brain at work. We can see which parts are over or underactive during auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations. We can find different patterns of neuronal firing in those with a paranoid stance. We can use these studies to see the difference between the brain of someone with thoughts that a secret agency is putting chips in his brain and otherwise healthy peers. Symptoms of schizophrenia are not always what people outside of medicine suspect. The inability to form spontaneous thought, the lack of drive or motivation for self-care, and a steep and steady drop in the ability to remain flexible in thinking can all be part of a psychotic disorder. People diagnosed with psychotic syndromes need powerful medications that expose the patient to the risk of severe, if not disabling or deadly side effects. Often the patient must quit working, accept disability, and make reducing stress and engaging psychotherapy or social rehabilitation their full-time job. Accepting the diagnosis of psychotic is not a trivial matter. Psychiatrists often set the bar very high for giving a formal diagnosis of schizophrenia or delusional disorder, and risk missing some patients due to the very rational fear of over-medicating the masses and creating another epidemic in their wake. On interviews with patients who happen to have religious faith, even the most evangelical and pious religious person will often add qualifiers and doubt regarding what they, quote, know compared to what they, quote, believe. Public proclamations on full faith in biblical text often fade, And what surfaces instead is a more rational view, accepting that although they themselves choose to have faith, they don't and can't claim to actually know with any more or less certainty than anyone else what a theistic God will do now or in the future. The political, social, and economic drive to have shared faith in an idea can be powerful. Patients are free to be genuine with their thoughts in a psychiatric interview because of the confidential nature of the encounter, where the culturally bound drives are diminished. Delusional patients, on the other hand, often lack the ability to even engage the notion of an alternative view. They do not need a Bible or a church or any other text or organization to validate or share their belief. A delusional person might believe they're married to a famous movie actor, for instance. Attempting to even discuss the idea that maybe it isn't so can be met with hostility and rage. I find political ideologies more firmly held and closer to delusional states than most religious views people bring into a doctor's office. Regardless, it doesn't take an experienced doctor very long to distinguish between a delusion and a culturally bound, strongly held belief. They are similar in some ways, of course, but not the same. The truly delusional patient is obvious to most everyone. When a delusional patient has been seen in the office, nurses, therapists, receptionists, paramedics, and everyone in between ends the workday saying, "That guy's sick." As funding for mental health is increasingly difficult to come by, and social services continue to shrink, it will become more important than ever to ensure the patients that need treatment the most can get it. Watering down the definition of psychotic delusion to include theists would send healthcare into a tailspin. Although it's debatable whether free will exists at all or not, thanks Sam Harris, excellent book by the way, I can safely say in lay terms that inasmuch as it does exist, theists are choosing to believe because it meets their intellectual, emotional, and social needs to do so. They are not grossly departed from the skeptic. Not in medical terms anyway. They are not mentally ill. Finally, skeptics need to be careful what we wish for. If delusional people are to be hospitalized for reprogramming, and atheists define religion as delusional, what's to stop the theists from doing the same to us? Skeptics tend to believe that something came from nothing as a way for understanding the origins of the universe. Although I tend to find the something from nothing argument sound after studying physics and reading essays written by Hawking and Tyson, one can easily see how quickly the idea of labeling and demonizing can be used against us. Something from nothing. You need medicine. Labeling as sick the wide range of normal human behavior, and what has forever been part of the human experience, belief without evidence is a threat to Western democracy and the pluralism enjoyed in most free societies. Skeptics need to win the battle of ideas and work to improve the human condition with art, science, medicine, and innovation. We need to be united in exuding empathy, offering compassion, and engaging in humanitarian efforts for social justice and peaceful coexistence. Hospitalizing grandma to reprogram her belief in a theistic God is not a good idea. She can pray for things to get better, and we can join the Thinking Atheist chat room and share ideas and try new things to improve this condition known as the human experience. No hospital and no medicine necessary. Regards, Herbert. Herbert, thank you very much for the email. I don't know that I've met a lot of people who say that people who are religious deserve to be hospitalized or reprogrammed. I do hear the word delusion and delusional when we speak about religious belief. Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion provided sort of a cornerstone for that argument, and I do see it as a form of delusion. But in my mind, I don't see it as the kind of delusion that I would consider warranting hospitalization or the cordoning off of other resources designed for the genuinely mentally ill. We are talking about a cultural thing. That's my take on it, but I'd really like to talk to an expert. Guess what? I've got one on the line, my special guest tonight. His name is Dr. Caleb Lack. He is a clinical psychologist and educator on psychology, critical thinking, and science versus pseudoscience. He writes the Great Plains Skeptic column on the Skeptic Inc. network, and he's a friend, and I'm glad he's on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Seth.
Let's talk about that first email. As you were listening on hold, did you have any thoughts as to Herb's take on psychiatry, on delusion, on how to approach mental illness in relation to religion? Anything strike that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Herbert was very much spot on in terms of saying, culturally accepted belief, when it's widespread, is not a delusion in terms of the clinical sense of the word. A nice way to think about it might be when you hear somebody who's a denier of science say, oh, well, evolution is just a theory. And by theory, they mean guess, but when we say theory, we mean something else entirely. And so when, someone like Dawkins with his title of his book says The God Delusion, he's certainly using it maybe more in a colloquial sense than a truly clinical sense. Because when you think about mental illness and delusions, Herbert gave great examples of what those are and defined those very well. And that's not the sort of everyday, oh, you're deluded because you think that Coke is better than Pepsi or whatever. I think it's very dangerous when we have people throw around those kind of terms that can be seen as clinical or as very problematic without actually knowing what they mean. You have the Kansas State School Board slap evolution is just a theory on your textbooks, just like you have people say, oh, religious belief is a delusion. I mean, those are both pretty ridiculous statements to me.
You've encountered people who've said they're just delusional. They believe in magic. They believe in superstition. They believe in fairies. They believe in angels. They're just delusional. You think that's an inappropriate term in this context?
Yeah, I really think it is. I'm a clinical psychologist. I see people with fairly severe mental illness all the time, in addition to, teaching about it and my job at the university. And I think for someone to say the word delusion, what they're really talking about is, I don't believe the same thing they do. And just because I don't believe the same thing you do doesn't mean that you're deluded in terms of a clinical sense of the word. So let me give you some examples. We see a lot of religious themes in the disorder that's my specialty, which is obsessive-compulsive disorder. One of the most frequent kinds of obsessions, which are these intrusive, unwanted thoughts, are religious-based obsessions, where I think that I'm blasphemous or I feel like I perhaps have sinned in some way and I have to pray a certain way or otherwise, I'm damning my family to hell. And we have somebody come in with those. Those are obviously so far outside of the bounds of normal religious belief that it's easy to say, yeah, this person, they're experiencing mental illness. They have something seriously wrong with them that's causing them to have functional impairment. But when you have people who say, oh, well, I believe in this or that particular deity or these rules about this deity, and it's a culturally accepted belief, it's by, a small percentage of the culture, to call that a delusion is, I think it's demeaning and it's insulting, in addition to just kind of being wrong in a technical sense. And it's a way of trying to, I think, separate or make yourself feel better compared to that group. I don't believe those things, so you're deluded, as opposed to, trying to understand, okay, well, why do you believe those things and I don't believe those things? What's the difference between us? And instead, it's just sort of insulting, I think.
Why do intelligent people often hold to unreasonable beliefs or irrational beliefs?
That's a great question.
It's also probably like a hugely broad question, and so I want to apologize in advance. It's probably a series of 6 shows and a whole lecture and several books. But
that's right.
I've called the show The Psychology of Belief, and I want to really start with getting down to the nitty-gritty. When you see somebody who is so freaking intelligent in every other area of his or her life, and then you see one part of I called this the other day, this is the place where the weird shit lives, right? This is where all of the crazy stuff that any scrutiny would dismantle immediately, it lives in this little protected membrane in here. And I want to know how this happens. So can you give the rest of us a primer on this, Caleb?
Sure. And, I think what's important to sort of step back and look at is, why do we believe anything that we do? Not just, why does someone believe something that's odd or strange or weird in comparison to this or that group? Because it's the same sort of underlying psychological mechanisms that are at play for believing that, Jesus is the Son of God, that it is for believing that vaccines are bad for you. And so I think that what you really want to step into how the human brain works and the ways that we naturally tend to fool ourselves when we are encountering information in our environment. And there's lots of evidence out there showing that your propensity towards believing certain things or having certain kinds of political ideology may be partially biological in terms of genetics and epigenetics. But there's a whole lot more evidence showing that, okay, well, why do we look at certain information and say, I'm going to believe this information? And then we look at other kinds of information and we say, oh, that's bullshit. I'm just going to completely ignore that. And it has a lot to do, I think, with how our brains are set up to process information from around us in the world. And so if you think about kind of the most common thing that we as humans do, it's we try and protect ourselves. We try and protect ourselves physically, and we try and protect ourselves mentally. And one of the ways that we try and protect ourselves mentally is by not challenging things that we believe. So we in psychology have actually a specific name for this, and it's called the confirmation bias. And the thing that's really interesting about, let's say that you and I are in conversation like we are tonight, and I say something that doesn't match up with something that you believe. You've got a couple of options at that point. You've got an option to say, okay, well, I'm going to change my beliefs and admit that I was wrong. Or you've got an option to say, hey, this guy is obviously dumb and stupid, and I'm going to ignore that information. And what we tend to do, just naturally, is we tend to ignore and discount information that doesn't fit with our already held beliefs. So I'm not talking necessarily about how we got there, but more of why it's maintained at this point. And we've got all these cognitive biases that we use. And the confirmation bias is probably the biggest bias that we have in terms of how we process information. And this is simply, I favor information that confirms my belief and my idea, and I discount information that does not support my idea. And we think about why would we do that? Why would we as humans have this natural tendency? It starts to make sense. What do we call people who are constantly doubting themselves, who think they're wrong all the time, who have problems with all sorts of decision-making because they can't fit things into a certain box? You know what we call those people? We call them depressed, right? So we have people who are depressed because I'm constantly doubting myself. I don't think that I'm any good. I don't think that I'm right. And then people who are not depressed, they tend to do very little doubting of themselves, which is pretty interesting. And this is, of course, this is for all information. This isn't just for religious ideology. But let's take religion as an example. Let's say that I'm a firm believer in the literal interpretation of the Bible. And I say, okay, well, there were Moses and the Jews that were in Egypt, and, they were enslaved, and then they escaped across the Red Sea and wandered for 40 years, and all that literally happened. And then I have an archaeologist who comes up and says, oh, yeah, we have zero evidence that any of this actually happened, that the Jews were ever in Egypt to begin with. There's no evidence of a mass wandering around the desert. There's not even really any evidence that they would have crossed the Red Sea. It was probably the Reed Sea instead. And if I'm a believer in the little interpretation of the Bible, I'm not going to carefully consider that information, right? I'm not going to look at it and say, you know what, let me think about this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hear that, and I'm going to say, that conflicts with what I believe. Therefore, you're a dirty liar. Instead of saying, let me look at this. And I'm going to do that because who likes to be wrong? Nobody likes to be wrong. We hate being wrong, most of us anyway. And so when we're confronted with these things, if I'm, again, that believer in the literal interpretation of the Bible, and one of my friends comes over and we're talking about this is an amazing thing that happened and how great Yahweh was to lead people out of here, and we talk about, of course this is true, then I'm going to be like, yes, that information comes in my brain, and I say, welcome home, right? I accept it. I'm happy to get that information. But then when someone else comes and says something different, I say, basically, screw you, right? That information contradicts what I believe. I'm just going to shut the door in the face of that information and say, get the hell off my porch. Don't come back. Get off.
Is it about pride? Is it about ego? Is it about comfort? Is it because we hold our beliefs, especially religious beliefs, in such high regard? They're so cherished to us that if they are challenged, it's almost like someone insulted our children, so we take it personally. I mean, why would I be so averse to vetting information that is presented contrary to what I currently believe? Why would I be so resistant?
I think the big issue there is exactly what you brought up. So I'm being challenged on this deeply held belief that I have, or even not even deeply held. We still don't like to be wrong. And what does that mean? I believe that this particular thing is right. You show me that it's wrong, that it's untrue, that there weren't any Jews in Egypt, or that vaccines are perfectly safe, or that UFOs don't land and anally probe people on a regular basis. What I do is I say, this contradicts what I believe. That means that I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, shit, that's not good for me. I hate that. We don't like to be wrong because that means that I've been believing something that's untrue. That makes me feel dumb. That makes me feel stupid. That makes me not be a good person. And so it's very much a protective mechanism. This is widespread. You do this. I do this. Everyone on earth does this. And it's very hard to kind of change your way of thinking to not do that. Even those of us who study these sort of things and teach other people about them and who pride ourselves on trying to be rational, we still do this. I mean, this is very much a knee-jerk cognitive reaction, if you will, to information. I don't like to be wrong. No one likes to be wrong. You give me information that says I'm wrong, I automatically have that response of no. That's not good. And what's interesting is there's lots of research showing that the more emotionally charged a belief is, or the more deeply held the belief is, the stronger our confirmation bias tends to act, which is exactly what you were asking about. And this goes for political issues. This goes for religious issues. I mean, this goes for sports teams. If you have a very emotionally charged or deeply held belief, that confirmation bias is basically exploded in its effort.
I'm talking here with psychologist and educator on psychology, Dr. Caleb Lack. Let's come back to genetics and environment. I'm guessing it's a 1-2 punch as to how we form and hold beliefs. Are some people more prone genetically to hold to the irrational than others? How does the machine of the brain work in this regard?
It's a great question, and I think one of the ways that I often frustrate people is that I tell them, well, we don't really know exactly. What I can say is that, like with most aspects of human behavior, it seems to be an interaction between our biology and our environment. People aren't just born being a fundamentalist versus a atheist liberal, right? But we do have some interesting research showing that there are certain kinds of personality characteristics, certain kinds of cognitive characteristics that lead one to be more likely to be skeptical versus non-skeptical of things like the supernatural and the paranormal. We actually just finished up about a year-long study looking at some of these over the summer. And when you think about things like personality differences in religious versus non-religious or skeptical versus non-skeptical folks, we find that personality, which is largely genetic, not entirely, but is largely influenced by your biology, we see that people who are more open to new experiences, whether those are physical experiences or holding new ideas in their mind, tend to be more skeptical of the supernatural. We also, and this was some interesting new findings, find that people who are more conscientious, they're more likely to follow through when they promise to do certain kinds of tasks and more likely to keep their word and do what they said they're going to do. They tend to be more skeptical, it seems. And then on an interesting note, especially with what you had talked about earlier, we find that those who tend to be less skeptical of things like the paranormal and the supernatural tend to be a little more neurotic. So they tend to have a little bit more emotional lability, so experience higher highs and lower lows in terms of emotions. And on all three of those things, your openness to experiences, your level of conscientiousness, and your neuroticism or your emotional stability all have a fairly high biological loading. You see that family members are more similar in terms of personalities than strangers. You see that you can predict, within certain limits, adult personality from infant temperament and things like that. So that to me points to, yeah, there are certain kinds of biological influences on belief. But you also have to think about those all interact with your environment. So it's more of a nature via nurture kind of thing than it is how a lot of people like to paint it, which is, oh, it's all nature or it's all environment. And it's really just more of this interaction effect.
Do people use religion to get kind of a high? I mean, do you get a dopamine rush from religious belief? Would that be part of the attraction?
So I'm guessing you've probably either been to or seen some of the really high energy evangelical ceremonies, right?
Been there, done that.
Been there.
Yes. Welcome to the first 25 years of my life.
So arms up in the air, right? Eyes closed. That's a very powerful experience for people, right? I mean, they're not just pretending. I mean, people are really into that moment. They're into that experience. And I'm there with other people who believe the same thing that I do. I'm getting reinforced for that. We're hugging, we're talking, we're feeling loved. Of course that's going to be a reinforcing environment. And we see the same things with our non-theistic community, right? So you're going up to Alaska tomorrow. You're going to see people really enjoying being together with other people who share the beliefs. I mean, they're going to come out for it, right? They're going to want to talk to you. They're going to want to talk to each other. We've seen this massive increase over about the last 10 years in these skeptical and atheist kind of conventions, We have them here in Oklahoma. We have them in Oklahoma, of all places, right? I mean, we've got the Oklahoma Free Thought Convention. And you get there and people they love being around others that share their same beliefs, whether it's political, whether it's, I go cheer for my sports team and I'm in a stadium full of 40,000 other people that all believe the same thing. My team's the best and your team sucks. I mean, that's a pretty huge rush in terms of biology, in terms of your psychology just being reinforced for your belief systems. And so, I mean, it makes a lot of sense why you gather, why these aren't just solitary activities. Although, you do see people who do religion by themselves. Most people don't. Most people do it with others. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you think about how reinforced you are and how much your confirmation bias is just sort of stoked in that sort of a situation, because it's like, yes, I am so right. I am completely right and wonderful and I love it.
I've met people who say, I'm high on Jesus, man. And there's like a literal high then. They're feeling the euphoria of a kind of high, being part of a community with the sort of the sensory overload that many church services are. Physical touch, people hugging and putting their hands on you. People are putting hands on each other's shoulder. You're laying on of hands. Dr. Andy Thompson was talking last year on a podcast about physical benefits that actually happen. The body can actually do a better job of healing itself or helping itself in many occasions when it experiences these kind of sensations. And this has been documented,
Sure.
Yes?
Oh, yeah. If you just think about physical isolation versus inclusion, we know that within a very short period of time, and this is one of the reasons why solitary confinement is so punishing in prisons, is that within a very short period of time, your immune system drops if you're isolated from others, your intelligence drops, your ability to solve problems, your ability to communicate. I mean, you have this huge, huge detrimental effect when you are isolated. And then that comes back when you're non-isolated, when you're around people, and especially if you're around people that are like you, and similar to you in some sort of way, and you're touching each other and you're releasing oxytocin, and you've got these wonderful sensations happening at the neuronal level and the chemical level, and then at the social level, everybody's telling you how glad they are to see you and how much they love you. I mean, that's an atmosphere that's just sort of primed for making you want to come back, whether that's a conference of atheists or whether that's a church service. And I think we've seen some pretty interesting moves in that regard among our non-theistic population when you look at things like the Sunday Assembly, which kind of takes a lot of the happy aspects of a church service, and leaves out the supernatural parts. And we're singing, and we're together, and we're enjoying each other's company. And I'm going to come back and do that because that feels good. That feels good, and it helps confirm what it is that I believe.
I've got some calls here on the switchboard. I will get to them. One last question very quickly. You mentioned something in a video interview we did, it was like a couple of years ago, about the psychology of belief. It's on my YouTube channel. I happened to be in Oklahoma City. I was part of a tour stop there, and I had a chance to sit down with Dr. Lack and put him on camera for a few minutes. And you talked about how when you speak to someone and say, you're wrong, there's a natural reaction to say, you know what? No, I'm right. You're wrong. You're doubly wrong. And right. I think you said something along those lines. It's an immediate sort of the walls go up, you're knee jerking, you're lashing out, you're saying, "Oh yeah, well, you said it earlier. Screw you, man. I'm doubly right and you're wrong." So if we're in the arena of ideas and we're trying to change minds, we're trying to promote rationality and sort of do away with irrationality. How do we approach someone who holds a cherished belief and be effective?
Well, you don't just go tell them they're wrong, right? Because you have that strong psychological reactance. The way I think about it is we as a society need to do a better job of helping people understand how the brain works, how our mind processes information, and understanding why is it that you believe what you believe. So, for example, I teach a course on critical thinking called Science and Pseudoscience. And, on the first day of class, I don't just stand up and say, everything you believe is wrong and you're stupid. So forget that. We're done. Start anew. What I do is I gradually show people, first, why you can't trust your brain because of all these ways that we tend to fool ourselves. And then I show why you can't trust society. So the ways that our society tends to influence our belief in various phenomena, either positively or negatively. And then what we do is we start looking at things that most people would agree are a little bizarre and odd. The presence of ghosts, for example, or Bigfoot, or alien abduction. And I take and I look at those kinds of supernatural, paranormal things that most people don't believe in. And we look at, but why do some people believe in them? Yeah, and then what's the contradictory evidence? And I think that's how you have to approach it. Because just by telling someone that they're wrong, you're not going to get anywhere. If I'm in an online argument, for example, with someone who thinks that ghosts are real, I can't just be like, yeah, they're not. Ghostbusters was not a documentary. It's not a real thing. They're just going to be like, but I have these experiences. And one of the things that we know is that experiences trump data. Stories are more easily understood and glommed onto than any amount of statistical data that you can give somebody. And this is one of the reasons why I think books like the one that you wrote are so important for people to read, is because it gives a story of how I came to believe or not believe in something, right? And people can hang their hat on that a lot easier than they can something that's more technical or more scientific, like Victor Stinger's arguments for why the universe is not actually fine-tuned to our existence. Like I start talking about that sort of thing, most people's eyes will just sort of blank out and they'll go to their happy place. But if I say, well, here's my friend Seth and here's his story, we start listening to stories more easily. And so when I teach about critical thinking, I do a lot of storytelling when I do that. So I'll tell stories about, for example, when we talk about aliens and alien abductions, I talk about my own personal experiences involving hypnopompic and hypnagogic hallucinations, which I've had for over 30 years. And these are ridiculous, terrifying things where in the middle of the night, either as I'm going to sleep or I'll wake up in the middle of the night, I'll literally have somatic, meaning physical or visual or occasionally auditory hallucinations that there are persons in my room, that there are presences in my room that are menacing, they're scary, and I'm usually paralyzed. So I have sleep paralysis at the same time. I can't move. I know I'm seeing these, literally seeing, my eyes are open, I'm awake, I'm seeing these things in my room. I'm feeling like I can't move. I'm terrified. My heart's beating out of control. And it's a horrible experience. And for the first about 15 years of my life, I had no idea what the hell was going on. And I thought I was probably a little bit crazy. And when you look at descriptions of people who've been abducted by aliens, they sound a lot like that, right? I woke up, there was something in my room, I couldn't move, I was scared, I saw things, I heard things, I couldn't explain this, and then I suddenly came to, and it was several hours later. And it turns out most people who have reported they've been abducted by aliens have a history of these sleep paralysis with these hypnopompic or hypnagogic hallucinations. And so I can use my experience to tell people how real this is and how utterly scary and frightening this stuff is. And it is. I mean, the other night I had one where I literally felt a giant snake crawling across my face and then down my body. And, the left part of my brain, the rational part's over there going, hey, it's cool, it's just a hallucination. And the right part of my game's going, good God, there's a snake on me. And I'm freaking out, I'm sweating, and my poor wife has to put up with these things, right? But you can say, and so here's why. I don't believe it's aliens, because now I know about this, right? I have a much better, more satisfactory explanation than, aliens were abducting me and using me in their experiments or whatever. And so I think being able to connect with people on a personal level is so important, rather than just telling them things like, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. How about, well, you know what? I used to believe this. Here's how I came to not believe that. And that has much more of an impact on people than just saying, you're wrong and I'm right, so you need to change your mind.
So instead of trying to drag them to a destination, forgive my oversimplification, Mr. Psychologist, but instead of dragging them to a destination, you are essentially trying to create the spark of curiosity and interest where they want to sort of carve that path and take the journey on their own terms. Would that be a relatively accurate way of saying it?
Exactly, because I grew up in the country, right? And so I tend to think a lot of country metaphors. And you've heard that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Well, if you try to make them drink, you're just going to drown the horse and then get wet yourself and get angry and pissed off, and it's not going to do anyone any good. And so instead, show people how and why beliefs are there in the first place and how they change. It's just think back in your own life. How many times have you argued with someone and then you've changed your mind as a result? How many debates really end with one side changing their prior beliefs? Not many, because that's not how we in general as humans work.
I've always wanted to see that happen during a formal debate. You get two antagonists on stage, right? You get a Dinesh D'Souza and a Daniel Dennett, and they go head to head. And midway through the discussion, Dinesh looks over at Daniel and goes, God, that's a damn good point. Hang on just a second. Let me reevaluate everything. Everyone in the audience, I tell you what, let's reconvene here in a couple weeks. And let me vet this information. I think that would be, and of course, it will never happen like that.
Never, right?
Ever will happen.
Yeah, you don't see Ken Ham stopping and be like, "Oh, Bill, you're right."
Yeah,
not going to happen.
Area code 513. Thank you so much for your patience. You're on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast. Who's this?
This is Mario from Ohio.
Mario, thanks for calling. What do you have for us?
I was wondering if your guest is familiar with the work of Robert Trivers.
Robert Trivers. It sounds familiar. What work in particular are you talking about?
He wrote a book called The Folly of Fools, The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception.
Okay. Yeah. He's a biologist, right?
Yes. If I remember right, and this is where the belief part comes in, one of the things that he suggests is that people who are good at self-deception, in other words, actually believe what they preach, are much better at persuading others. And so there's a benefit to that, and that's the title.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that makes people who have beliefs that are deeply held so persuasive is the fact that they do hold those so deeply, right? If I don't really believe something, I'm trying to convince you of it. Let's say that I was trying to convince you that, that vaccines are a terrible idea, but I don't really believe that. You're going to be able to tell, like, this guy, he doesn't really get this. He's trying to trick me. But if I'm really good at tricking myself into believing something that's not true, then I'll be able to fool you much more easily. So I personally would think of these so-called psychics that are out there, who, like James von Prague or John Edwards, who they tell us, oh yeah, I really am psychic. And I have to wonder deep down, do they really believe that? Do they really think that they're connecting with the dead, despite all the evidence showing that they're not? Or are they just really, really good at deceiving themselves? And is that why people are so able to buy into them? And I think it's a very interesting idea.
If you have someone who's essentially approaching something emotionally, and they are fire and brimstone, and they are heaven and hell, and the universe was created just for you, or any compelling sounding story given with verve, is obviously going to resonate more with the general population than, say, the writings of Victor Stenger. Do you think form has something to do with how effective the message is?
Yeah, I definitely do. The more passionate you are about something, people can tell, right? As opposed to, I'm just kind of phoning this in. I am here on the ground with you, and I believe this. If I give a emotionally charged talk, for example, versus a more clinically detached talk, you're going to connect with me more, right? If I use humor more when I talk as opposed to just being dry, you're going to connect with me more. And so you're going to be more likely to believe in what I'm telling you, because it turns out when we're highly emotional, our reasoning is very suppressed. And so, whether that's I'm angry or I'm happy or whatever, we don't do well at reasoning when we're being highly emotional. And so if I can push those buttons on you, then I can get you to believe me much more easily.
One of the reasons I asked that was because I often hear Aaron Ra and Matt Dillahunty when they're talking about Ray Comfort. Aaron thinks Ray Comfort knows he's deceiving people, and Matt thinks, no, I think Ray Comfort really believes what he's saying. And this book suggests that both can be true.
Sure. It doesn't have to be one or the other, right?
Right, yeah, they can both be true. And by the way, when you were talking about people who are high on Jesus and they get these emotional rushes at these, is that possible that they can actually get addicted? That sounds like something you'd get addicted to.
That's a good question. Addiction's an interesting term. I'm very much a behavioralist, so I think of things in terms of, is it reinforcing or not? And is that behavior reinforcing? Absolutely. Is being in that environment reinforcing? Absolutely. And so when I'm reinforced, that makes me want to do something over and over again. I think the term addiction, much like we're talking about, yeah. And then all the folks in the last 60 years too.
Yeah.
But I think using the term addiction is problematic. Using the term addiction in that sort of a context is much like using the term delusion to me. Like it doesn't fit. It's using a clinical term for something that's not really a clinical activity.
Yeah, I'm a little familiar with some of the things about addiction. For example, one of the symptoms would be that if it's really an addiction, you'd experience withdrawal symptoms, right? In some form.
When we talk about substance abuse in particular, yeah.
I'm wondering sometimes if these people don't make it to the next meeting, if that's a stress in their life or not.
Hey, Mario, thanks for the call, my friend. Appreciate it very much.
Hey, you bet.
Thanks, Mario.
Take care. Bye-bye.
I've got an email from Jean. Jean said, my sister and I are at extreme opposites of the religion spectrum. I'm a newly minted atheist. She's devout Christian. Church and God are central to her life, and she takes tremendous comfort in it. We were raised in a very religious Baptist family, and we're in church every time the doors were open. When I was young, I liked church. Our Sunday school and children's services were fun. Once we were expected to attend the real church services, it was not an experience I enjoyed. I believed in God, but never felt moved by the services and never felt God in my heart the way some did. Church was something I did because I wasn't allowed to skip it. Church was something my sister did because she truly loved it. Even as a teenager, though she rebelled in other ways, she always wanted to go to church. Once I was in college, I stopped going, and very gradually I became less and less religious. I began questioning, and eventually, well into my adulthood, I identified as an atheist. My sister has never wavered in her faith despite some tough times. We both maintain the core values our parents taught us, with the exception of religion in my case, but are very different in every other way, in everything from personality to career to political beliefs. She does know and accept I'm an atheist, but when I first came out to her and asked if she had ever questioned, she emphatically and firmly said no. I'm convinced there's absolutely nothing that could sway her, not that that's my goal. This is going to be an interesting podcast. I hope it will give me some insight into what makes one person wholeheartedly embrace religion while it never fully takes for another person growing up in the same environment with the same level of indoctrination. Signed, Gene. It's an interesting case study. You've got two siblings raised in the same home environment, the same church environment, and yet both of them split paths.
One of, I think, the most interesting things about studying people is that you have a intuitive belief, most of us do anyway, that, if two people are raised in the same home, you have siblings in this case, they're going to come out relatively similar, right? And the research actually says emphatically no. And it finds that, for example, adult personality is more due to what we call unshared environmental characteristics rather than shared environmental characteristics. So, for example, their siblings, I don't know how far apart they are in age, let's assume a couple of years, they're not going to exactly be raised in the same environment in terms of I'm 2 when you're 4, right? And so when I'm 4, my 4-year-old environment is different than your 4-year-old environment. And so my guess would be that there were some sort of shifts or changes while they were growing up, where one of them was exposed to something in a very different way environmentally than the other was. Or in some way, they have biological differences as well. If they're siblings, they share about 50% of their unique genetic material. And so maybe one of them is different in personality than the other, and it turns out that actually shapes our environment as well. It's not just that our environment shapes our personality shapes our environment. How I respond to your environment changes my environment. And so it's interesting to me to hear these kinds of stories because people assume that, we grew up in the same house, we were raised the same way. Chances are you actually weren't, though. So, you lived in the same house physically. Maybe physically you had the same parents there. But there's a good chance that the parents responded differentially to the children, even, if they're very similar in age. They may have involved themselves in different peer groups, and those groups would cause you to sway more towards, theism and non-theism, and that they had some sort of underlying biological, cognitive, and personality differences that kind of helped shape that as well.
I'll take Gene's example one step further, all right? I am a fraternal twin. My twin sister is 5 minutes older than me, all right? We aren't 2 years apart. We aren't 2 days apart. We shared a womb. You know what I'm saying, people? And people say, the first thing people say, which boggles the mind, is, oh, you have a twin sister? Are you identical? And I'm like, there's some basic biology that needs to be taught here before we have this conversation. But the second interesting thing is that as we speak, I am an atheist activist, an ex-Christian. And she is a Sunday go-to-meeting, true blue, Bible-believing Jesus follower with homeschooled children. And if you see two people who, we were born 5 minutes apart, raised in the exact same home, and our paths diverged like that, does personality play into it, personal characteristics?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one thing that our research over the last year or so has found is that those who believe less in the supernatural, they used to call them skeptics, the skeptics tend to be just more okay with ambiguity. Like, I'm more able to tolerate not knowing something for sure. We see that skeptics tend to have less of a preference for things being highly predictable and highly ordered, and that our skeptics tend to engage in and enjoy thinking and cognitive activities more. And then finally, and this is a huge one, they tend to have less of a need to conform to societal standards. Like, I'm more okay not being a member of the in-group. When you think about those sort of qualities, you think, oh, let me think about the atheist or the non-theist that I know. Yeah, that kind of fits a lot of them, right? Let me think about the theists I know. They like things to be pretty predictable, right? I'm not okay with saying I don't know. I say, oh, no, I have to have a reason. I like to conform, basically, right? I'm believing what the majority of people out there believe in. I'm acting in a way that's pretty similar to how others around me act. I'm not necessarily open to thinking about things in new and unexpected ways. I say, no, let me just stick with what I got. And so there's certainly those kind of cognitive personality characteristics. But in you and your sister's case, obviously there's gender to think about too. Because, I'm sure that hugely impacted how your parents treated you, how society treated you, peer groups. And so, that's another kind of play there.
Area code 616. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
This is Richard from Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Thanks for calling, Richard. What do you have for me and or Dr. Caleb Lack tonight?
Oh, Dr. Lack, just thank you for being on. I wanted to raise my hand. We've heard from mental health professionals, both in email and now, through conversation. And I just want to raise my hand and say that I am someone you might call mentally ill. I recently went through a really rough time in life. It's incredibly hard to talk about, but long story short, I ended up admitting myself into a psychiatric hospital. There I was diagnosed with major depressive and anxiety disorder. But post-discharge, in counseling and evaluation, it revealed a refined diagnosis of social anxiety disorder and autism spectrum disorder. I had no idea for 28 years just what I was struggling with. And so to find that out was just such a relief that I'm not crazy, that it's not wrong, that there are many people out there like me. But what I wanted to bring up was that it is not just the mentally ill that will end up believing in things that aren't real. It is people with my particular brand of autism. See, 5 years ago, you might have said that I have Asperger's syndrome. But under the DSM-5, my official diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder. And such that people with my particular brand of autism, we are far less likely to believe in religious nonsense than the general population. A study by Boston University on a forum of people who called themselves identify as Aspies found and showed, at least among that group, that they were half as likely to identify as religious as either Christian or Jewish, twice as likely to identify as atheist or agnostic. And so I wanted to get out there and say that it's a disservice to people who struggle with real mental illness to say that something as simple as religious beliefs can be defined as a mental illness. There are those out there who have gone through a lot of problems to get to where we are now.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for your call, and I'm sorry that you had to struggle with that for so long, and I hope that you're able to get some good help now that you kind of know what's going on. It's really, really tough for a lot of people out there who just feel I'm different and I'm not sure why or what's going on, but I just kind of have to muddle through life. And so I applaud you for going and seeking treatment, and I applaud you for speaking openly about that. As far as the influence of things like autism on religion, it's really interesting. Like you mentioned, we see many of the people who are on the autism spectrum not believers, much more so than the regular sort of population. And for those people who are autistic who are believers, it tends to be more kind of a ritualistic, less emotionally based religion. It's not that I really feel a connection to, Jesus or God or Allah. It's that this is what I do. This is kind of the routine that I engage in. And so, again, I completely 100% agree with you that throwing these terms out, mentally ill, delusion, I think they are, they certainly are wrong, and they can't be insulting to people who are actually struggling with those kinds of challenges on a day-to-day basis like yourself. So I really appreciate you calling and kind of getting that out there.
Great call, Richard.
So,
Appreciate you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Laxton. Thank you, Seth, for everything you do. Love
Appreciate you very much. Take care.
You too.
You know, there is a stigma about mental illness. If your lungs aren't functioning properly, you go in and you have them examined and treated, and people see it as the treatment of a human organ. You know, you got a heart problem, your kidneys aren't working correctly, there's something physically wrong with a muscle or a bone. But if you have some sort of defect or problem with the brain, people often treat you differently. Is this a common thing, Dr. Lack?
It's extraordinarily common, Seth. I think there's a couple of reasons why. You know, one is that people would consider it kind of, you know, it's shameful, right? We hide these things away because they're shameful. I think the more interesting reason is to look historically, like back at how we've conceptualized mental illness. So if you put your historian hat on, for example, and you step back a couple thousand years, you see Greek physicians and Roman physicians primarily attributing what we now call mental illness to biological problems, like a disturbance of the humors, for example. Or if you had certain kinds of mental illness, you might even be considered special and touched by the gods in some way, right? So if I've got what we would now call OCD and I have to do these things in repetitive nature and repeat things, well, they've been touched by the gods. You don't say, okay, well, we need to lock them away. You really see this shift in views towards mental illness, interestingly enough, with the rise of Christianity, where people who we would now consider mentally ill were considered that way not because, you know, they had something just wrong with them physically and they weren't treated by how the Greeks treated it, for example, which was rest and relaxation. They were treated as if they were possessed by demons and the devil, right? And if there was some sort of terrible, horrible thing wrong with them, and, well, how did you treat them? Well, you beat them. You know, you torture them to get the demons out of them. And that kind of attitude towards the mentally ill really arose there with the start of Christianity and it becoming an institutionalized religion. And then, of course, you have all the other problems that arise from that, which is, okay, now this person's mentally ill, so maybe they're a witch, right? And let's burn them all. And so I think we have a lot of our stigma towards mental illness arises from this mind-body dualism that we see with Christianity in terms of, you know, physical things. You know, maybe those just happen, but mental things, they happen because you're a bad person. They happen because you're possessed by the devil, which is obviously, pardon my language, fucking ridiculous. You know, I have yet to find a person post-exorcism who's like, you know what, there went my schizophrenia. Yeah. You know, thank you so much for that. You know, this stigma that we have towards mental illness in many ways is a remnant of that idea that, you know, there's something bad about you as a person and that's why this happened to you. As opposed to people don't tend to say, oh, they got cancer, probably a demon, right? Probably a demon. Got to exercise the cancer out.
Actually, I know a few Pentecostal churches that would have pulled that one in a heartbeat, yeah. Yeah.
I should say most people, not all, certainly.
I've got an email from Sandy who said this. I have a question, actually several questions, but initially, why do religions and their teachings go against human nature? Sex is bad. Well, we know sex isn't bad, but too many young people have grown up not knowing themselves enough to know what they like, hence they have a difficult time establishing a healthy, loving, intimate relationship with another human being. Don't think for yourself. Well, isn't that what humans do best? I blame my indoctrination for turning off a lot of things in my brain which could have served me well as an adult. Cognitive functions I was trained to turn off. Do not enjoy this life but look forward to the next. Huh? Sorry, this one's all I'll remember while I'm here. I'm going to enjoy it now. So essentially, Sandy's question is, why does religion and the teachings of religion so often go against what human beings do naturally?
I think just saying that, well, this is what we naturally do is a little bit of an oversimplification because people are so naturally, pardon the term, naturally different, you know, and unique. Some people really enjoy sex. Some people don't, for example. I think her bigger question is, you know, sort of why would you have these mechanisms in place that might help to deny some aspects of most people's basic nature? And for me, when I look at it, I think about it from a control perspective. how am I going to make the population, in general, maybe be more docile, fall in line a little easier? Well, you have to have some sort of method of control. Humans are social animals. We tend to be hierarchical social animals. I walk into a room and I'm trying to sort of judge, okay, where's my status in relationship to everybody else? And so you have a large number of institutions, religion certainly being one of them, that seek to kind of codify that social structure and cause you to know your place. And one of the ways that you can sort of control people is by telling them what they can and can't do and making them feel bad if they do certain things. So if you think about the concept of sin, for example, these things are bad. Why? Well, they're bad because they go against what I say is right and natural. And that might be different from what you say is right and natural, right? Like, yeah, we can dance in this religion, but we can't dance in this one, for example. And I think it stems to a control issue in many regards. And I don't know that that's necessarily even religious as much as is just kind of we as a society like to control and have order and predictability for the most part. And that's a way to do that, to ensure that, people don't go outside of what the norm is. I may be wrong. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I'm totally in agreement with you about control. In the religious context, they tell you you're broken, they tell you you're diseased, and then sell you the cure. And then if they can get into your bedroom, they've essentially controlled your life, right? They control whether or not you can enjoy human sexuality. They control childbirth. They control offspring. They control basic decisions in your home, outside of your home. I honestly think that restricting people and laying down harsh rules, even the ones that might even incidentally end up being good ideas, but because they are edicts of the church, I think it's all about the church's stranglehold on the individual, because it doesn't want individuals. It doesn't want clear thinkers, free thinkers, rational thinkers, skeptics. It wants people who line up lockstep and hold to the party line, even if it's a religious one, especially if it's a religious one. I'm doing a speech in 2 days in Anchorage about doubt, and it's sort of an elongated version of the presentation that I've been doing on the Unholy Trinity tour. The beauty of doubt, essentially sort of turning the whole concept of doubt on its ear. We in the church have been raised to believe that doubt's a problem, doubt's a sin, and you have a whole other take on doubt. You want to kind of give me the Cliff's Notes version and pitch the book real quick?
Sure. So I write for the Skeptic Inc. Network, which is a big collection. I think we've got over 20 writers at this point of highly, highly varied folks who all come from a skeptic sort of perspective. And I write a column that deals a lot with psychology. We've got a biologist on there. We've got several philosophers and so on. And we, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, actually published our first book, and it's called 13 Reasons to Doubt. And it's new essays from 13 of the writers from the network that are all about skepticism and doubting and why it's okay to doubt. Because it is. I mean, that's a good thing in my view, in my opinion, and that's sort of what science is predicated on, is doubt. I don't try and prove my hypothesis correct in science. What I do is I try and set up my experiments to disprove my hypothesis, to make sure that I don't fall prey to those confirmation biases that we talked about earlier. And so we've got some great things in that book. One's on why you should doubt free will. One's on a little sort of small history of great doubters, so great skeptics throughout history. My chapter is called Why You Can't Trust Your Brain. And it's all about, these cognitive biases and these mental heuristics we have that really should make you doubt yourself. Because that's something most people don't do, and I think it's a really important thing to do, is you don't just trust yourself blindly. You step back and examine what you believe. You step back and look at, why do I believe this? Why do I think this is the best political party? Why do I think this is the best way to view religion or to, do whatever it is? And so I encourage folks to check that out. It's available on Kindle right now, and I think next week we launch the paperback. But you can just look up 13 Reasons to Doubt.
Yeah, I'll include the link in the description box. 13 Reasons to Doubt essays from the writers of Skeptic Inc. I'll make sure that you guys have access to that. Any final thoughts on belief in the brain before we wrap it up for the evening, Dr. Lack?
I would just say that our brains are these wonderfully complex, amazingly resilient organs, one of the most complex things that we've ever seen in the universe. But that doesn't mean that they aren't easily fooled. And that doesn't mean that they don't process information in a way that's not logical and rational. And so doubting yourself, keeping an eye on your own beliefs and the beliefs of those around you is a crucial thing if you're going to be a good scientific skeptic, a good non-theist, a good person in general.
Fantastic. Dr. Caleb Lack, thank you for being a part of the show tonight.
All right. Thank you, Seth.
I want to leave you with a short series of paragraphs from Robert Greene Ingersoll, and it goes like this. I thought it was a great way to cap the show. It said this: like most of you, I was raised among people who knew, who were certain. They did not reason or investigate. They had no doubts. They knew that they had the truth. In their creed, there was no guess, no perhaps. They had a revelation from God. They knew the beginning of things. They knew that God commenced to create one Monday morning, 4,004 years before Christ. They knew that in the eternity back of that morning, he had done nothing. They knew that it took him 6 days to make the earth, all plants, all animals, all life, and all the globes that wheel in space. They knew exactly what he did each day and when he rested. They knew the origin, the cause of evil, of all crime, of all disease and death. At the same time, they knew that God created man in his own image and was perfectly satisfied with his work. They knew all about the flood, knew that God, with the exception of 8, drowned all of his children, the old and young, the bowed patriarch and the dimpled babe, the young man and the merry maiden, the loving mother and the laughing child, because his mercy endureth forever. They knew, too, that he drowned the beasts and birds, everything that walked or crawled or flew, because his loving kindness is over all his works. They knew that God, for the purpose of civilizing his children, had devoured some with earthquakes, destroyed some with storms of fire, killed some with his lightnings, millions with famine, with pestilence, and sacrificed countless thousands upon the fields of war. They knew that it was necessary to believe these things and to love God. They knew that there could be no salvation except by faith and through the atoning blood of Jesus Christ. Then I asked myself the question, is there a supernatural power, an arbitrary mind, an enthroned God, a supreme will that sways the tides and currents of the world, to which all causes bow? I do not deny, I do not know. But I do not believe. I believe that the natural is supreme, that from the infinite chain no link can be lost or broken, that there is no supernatural power that can answer prayer, no power that worship can persuade or change, no power that cares for a man. Is there a God? I do not know. Is man immortal? I do not know. One thing I do know, and that is that neither hope, nor fear, belief, nor denial can change the fact. It is as it is, and it will be as it must be. We can be as honest as we are ignorant. If we are, when asked what is beyond the horizon of the known, we must say that we do not know. We can tell the truth, and we can enjoy the blessed freedom that the brave have won. We can destroy the monsters of superstition, the hissing snakes of ignorance and fear. We can drive from our minds the frightful things that tear and wound with beak and fang. We can civilize our fellow men. We can fill our lives with generous deeds, with loving words, with art and song, and all the ecstasies of love. We can flood our years with sunshine, with the divine climate of kindness, and we can drain to the last drop the golden cup of joy. Thank you so much for listening to the show tonight. I am on my way to Anchorage, Alaska. I hope to see some of you at the event Thursday night. The Unholy Trinity speeches airing Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of next week, and I will see you soon on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Take care.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.